Our next speaker is Professor Schmid, and he is a distinguished fellow of the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, ICCT, The Hague, and co-editor of its journal Perspectives on Terrorism. He was, until 2009, also co-editor of the journal Terrorism and Political Violence, and is the editor of the Routledge Handbook of Terrorism Research and of the ICCT Handbook of Terrorism Prevention and Preparedness. Dr. Schmid has been a NATO Research Fellow and a member of the Partnership for Peace Consortium of Directors of Research Institutes in the field of security studies. Previous positions included Director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, and Officer in Charge of the Terrorism Prevention Branch of UNODC in Vienna. Currently, he is one of the 3 directors of the Terrorism Research TRI, or consortium of institutes and scholars engaged in collaborative efforts to study terrorism. He has more than 225 book chapters, articles, reports, and other publications to his name. And you're a veteran of this conference. We see you here every year. And St. Andrews has a very nice golf course. The floor is yours.
It's always a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Boaz Gano for inviting me once again. I will not talk about definitions. Actually, I'm quite happy with Boaz's definition, and since mine, it was shorter than his, namely terrorism as peacetime equivalence of war crimes, comes close to his. Anyway. What I did is I tried to test what we know, and nobody, even if he reads 24 hours, 7 days a week, can overlook the field any longer. So I decided to do some survey. Actually, I had done that already 2.5 years ago. But now I repeated it. Then I called it a glimpse. Now I called it a look. But the sample I had was not much bigger. 50 plus people answered. First, I asked about 24 experts what are the 10 most important questions to ask them. And on the basis of their responses, I get these 10 questions, of which you see here the second half. And who answered these questions? Well, we aimed it at the directors of the 200 programs, think tanks, research centers on terrorism. And we had more than a dozen responses from them, but we had even more from academics. And there were, of course, overlaps of these responses. Well, first, we asked, what are you doing now? And here you see that the field is a bit broader than AQ and IS, that it also includes Buddhist and Hinduist extremist groups. Gender-based violence is coming up as a specific new area, incel terrorism. But the biggest growth area is number 5, anti-government extremism, that has really taken hold. And if you look at global databases, it doesn't show up because much of it is a bit under the threshold of terrorism. But if you look at national databases, for instance, the Bundeskriminalamt's MOTRA, Monitoring and Trend Analysis Database, and if you talk to people in mayors, for instance, in Germany, I talk to, then you see that threats against public officials is really a fast-growing threat. I asked also, what do you plan to do in the near future? And as so often, the future is a continuation of the present. But of course, one topic that came up was the impact of climate change directly and indirectly through the migration pressures from the Sahel, for instance, towards Europe. It's expected by UN that 150 million people will be displaced between now and 2050 in the world, and you can imagine that that can create some xenophobia. So that is an area that needs to be studied. Another question is, where do you see progress? Well, there has been progress, but the PowerPoint doesn't show it. The progress I was most pleased with to see is the development of the concept of stochastic terrorism. That is an indirect form of terrorism that is greatly facilitated, but not only depending on the internet. Somebody says this is a guy is an enemy of the people, and people are sometimes picking up this idea. I remember in the 1970s when we studied the influence of TV violence on real-life violence, and somebody said only 1 in 7,000 people imitates what he sees on TV. But with audiences of hundreds of millions, of course, that is a dreadful prospect. But this stochastic terrorism has really taken on, and it's not only in the right-wing area that it's happening. Many of the attacks that were attributed to Al-Qaeda after 9/11 were in fact not directly financed, instructed, guided, but were imitated by people who liked the ideology and thought they could contribute to the cause. So when populist leaders and in government and out of government identify public enemies, this is very bad development, and unfortunately, they cannot, in some areas, in some countries where there is a First Amendment, easily be charged. So these are some of the areas that were identified by our experts as understudied. The victims of terrorism, they're often deplored, their prayers are with them, but they have not been studied. But some victims are worth studying because there are chains of victims becoming perpetrators because of revenge, and perpetrators becoming victims, and many perpetrators actually see themselves, rightfully or wrongly, as victims. So the victim aspect needs to be studied. Somehow, over the years, terrorism has been applied more and more to non-state actors, but we heard it in the last 2 days with what Iran does in the world, and probably also what Russia does, not only in the Ukraine. It is an area that we should turn our attention to more than it's happening to now. One problem that's eternal is how to measure the effectiveness in counterterrorism. I mean, unfortunately, many of these big events in the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq have been, well, counterproductive counterterrorism in some ways. We have, when it comes to measuring, indexing, and comparing non-state terrorism, we have a global terrorism index, which is developed on the basis of START's database and now on Dragonfly's database by the Australian Institute for Economics and Peace. It uses just 4 indicators and then looks at all the countries and ranks them. In my view, it's not a very good indicator, but we don't have anything like that in the field of counterterrorism. And if we would want to construct such a barometer of counterterrorism, we would have to pick as many as possible of these variables. Now, the US State Department in its annual reports has some overviews of what countries does. On a minor scale, Europol also looks at some of these indicators, but it needs to be systematized. We see such barometers, for instance, for conflicts by the Heidelberg Institute. We see such barometers for organized crime by my former colleague Mark Shaw, who is now working out of New York. So these are some areas where there are research gaps seen. I see the clock is ticking like hell, so I have to race through that. But so much depends on high-quality data. And high-quality data require, again, a common definition for databases, and it requires funding. The world of terrorism study is strewn with databases that came to an end because funding was ended. Another issue that was identified by our experts were the gaps between what academia knows and what government knows. And the feeling was often that academia was further than government, and it was a question of speaking truth to power. In Israel, this relationship is excellent, but in other countries, it leaves a lot to be desired. Then another question addressed the issue of radicalisation and its prevention. And what is still the gold standard in Europe, at least, is the Aarhus model based on community work. Then countering violent extremism, it has become a growth industry, almost an industry. But again, we know very little about what works. We need replication studies, we need evaluation studies more than we have. Of course, the subject area is very difficult to study. But one area where really investment is worthwhile and cannot be counterproductive, I think, is in the area of creating narratives and counter-narratives to those of the terrorists. Of course, the basis of it is that what we preach is also what we practice. If there is a gap between what we say and what we do, then whatever we say will look hypocritical. But I think in this area we have to invest more, and it is a investment that is well worthwhile. Then at the end, we did some horizon scanning, what is going well in the field, and I think the quality has improved tremendously. Some years ago, Mark Schmid complained that the field of terrorism research was stagnating. Nobody could say that these days. Each second year, I organize a competition for the best PhD thesis in the field of terrorism, counter-terrorism, and I've done that over the years, and I see tremendous sophistication and improvement. So there are good developments in the study of terrorism and its application in policies. However, now that there has been a shift of government funding away from terrorism studies to big power competition, there is a danger that some of the money invested in this field gets lost as researchers change sides. If you think everything has been studied and studied long enough, I have here 6 topics which I think should be studied in more depth. These are studies suggested by some of our experts, and if you have a PhD student who is looking for a subject, give him one of these and let me know. These then are all the people, and some of them actually sitting here in the room, who contributed to that survey I did, of which I only gave you a teaser. In the December issue of Perspectives on Terrorism, you will see a long report with more than 500 answers to these 10 questions. Thank you for your attention.